Okay. And as you all know, my name is Heather Flanagan. I'm one of the 2 REFEDS coordinators along with Nicole Harris. And we've been putting together this community chat series to give us an opportunity to deep dive into some of the fun things that REFEDS is doing and to allow people to ask questions in spaces that they may not be working directly with. Joining me today, Keith Hazelton of Internet2, been working in this space for a really long time. Benn Oshrin will be joining us as well, though he's running a little bit late, so he'll come in a little bit. And as I mentioned, if you've got questions, feel free to raise your hand, let us know. We'll also be taking questions at the end. So we did really have a lot of fun with exclamation points. More to the point, Ben had a lot of fun with exclamation points in the slides today. So just smile and let it go. We're going to talk a little bit about basically how REFEDS manages the different attribute schema that we have. So we'll talk about what the schema board does. We'll talk about what schemas we manage, because it is more than just eduPerson. We'll talk about the consultation process and what consultations are underway or have been recently. Talk about some of the other current work, which may be of interest. Talk about things that are related to this space that you should probably know about. And of course, we will invite you to join us in the fun, because while, we understand that schema may not be the sexiest thing that you can work on in your portfolio, it is actually pretty important, because it's one of those foundational pieces of what makes identity work. So there is a schema board, and current schema board members include, let's see if I can remember this off the top of my head, Benn Oshrin, Keith Hazelton, David Bance, Christos Kanelopoulos, Alan Buxey, Terry Smith, Mark Rank, and me. I think I got everybody. If you go to the REFEDS wiki.refeds.org, you will find, and you just search on schema board, you'll come to our pages and you will find the full list in case I missed anybody. The board members serve for 2 years, and we've staggered the terms so that we don't, have a 100% turnover in any given year. People are more than welcome to nominate themselves to continue on, or not, as they chose. The board doesn't necessarily have to do all the things. We do have subcommittees if there's a particular area of interest. So for example, right now there is an interest in adding a new attribute to eduPerson to hold personal pronouns. And so there is a subcommittee that focuses just on that work. Similarly, there's a subcommittee that focuses on voPerson and a couple other things. The subcommittees are open to the public. You don't have to be, obviously there's no particular membership required, but it's worth noting that since all the schema work is managed under REFEDS, then all the participation is managed by the REFEDS Participants Agreement. We have a mailing list, schema-discuss. And that's was created in no small part because of feedback that people who really didn't need to worry about schema every day did not want to see the REFEDS list cluttered with some of the discussions we tend to have about schema themselves. So we have a list purely focusing on that. Aha! See, did I miss anybody? Mario, I knew I was going to miss somebody. Dang it. There are our members. Some have been on for pretty much since day one, for which we are very, very grateful for their time and effort. And we have room for more. If you want to be involved in the nitty-gritty details, we're always looking for additional people to indicate interest in serving on the board. Okay, so what schema do we have? How many of you have heard of eduPerson? I know you're all going to raise your hand there, right? Right. Okay. But that's definitely not the only one. There's also the schema for academia, SCHAC, which is used primarily in the Nordic countries. and maybe in some other small places in Europe. It's a very interesting schema to me because it covers some things that are definitely more interesting in a strongly multicultural environment. So like mother tongue, if you want to, what if you assume that someone is going to be speaking many different languages, but you really want to know what the source one is to help personalize their information, that schema has something for that. So it's an interesting schema that is supposed to complement eduPerson, not take the place of. LDAC public key is a very, very specific focused schema that we have adopted with permission, and voPerson, which focuses very much on the needs of virtual organizations, research collaborations, things like that. All right, so when changes happen in any of the schema Editorial Board follows the REFEDS consultation process. That is available, of course, on the REFEDS wiki, because where else would it be? You can see there sort of the record of all the past consultations that REFEDS have ever done. What ends up happening is either the board or the board subcommittees develop the specifications or the changes that are being proposed, and then send it out to the broader REFEDS community for that consultation. Right now, we do have a consultation open on the display pronouns, which I mentioned earlier, and that's open until next week. And we just wrapped up a consultation to expand, to update the SCHAC schema from 1.5 to 1.6. Probably the biggest change there is to deprecate SCHAC gender. Some of the logic behind that being that the SCHAC gender really didn't have much in the way of options, I guess I would say. It was dependent on, well, what does ISO choose as appropriate genders to be recorded? And that didn't seem to make sense. And then there was the question of, and why would anyone actually need to know? Is anyone using this at all? It was an attribute fraught with peril and potential misinformation. So we agreed, after a community member suggestion, to go ahead and deprecate that. Current work. Is this one still mine?
I can jump in for a bit.
Tag, you're it.
Okay. All right. So this is work that gets itself onto the agendas for meetings, recent, past, present, and into the future. So a lot of this is not finally resolved in any way, shape, or form. So there's still a chance for people that have thoughts and opinions about this to weigh in. The protocol split topic, if we go way back to the 20 plus years when eduPerson was first defined, the world was still thinking that LDAP was a relatively new thing in the world. It also looked like the only thing for this kind of schema representation. So eduPerson ended up beginning and continuing to this day as a very LDAP-centric specification. And in the meantime, of course, we've had SAML come along, and then OIDC, and we fully expect and can predict that new protocols, new transport mechanisms will become popular, and we'll have to work with those as well. So all of those considerations led to this idea that wouldn't it be great if we had a representation of the schema that didn't restrict itself to one schema, particular schema or protocol language. And so this idea of raising the level of abstraction of the core attribute schema for things like eduPerson and voPerson kind of got some currency, and we've been discussing how to do that in a way that doesn't mess up current uses of the schemas, but maybe gives us a little better position for moving into the future. So that requirement around not messing things up is the third bullet under protocol split here. If you're running something that's using any of these schema, nothing we do in this sort of refactoring should have any impact, shouldn't mandate any changes on your operations or configurations. But as I say, the goal is to have a clean base from which to move towards other schemas and protocol languages in the future. That's one thing that's ongoing. The other is what Heather already mentioned, this, the notion that some attributes that appeared early on have not been really widely adopted, supported. Heather ran some surveys about SCHAC gender and found out that there was zero to little adoption and use of that attribute for, if you think about it, probably for not too surprising. But at any rate, the question, poses itself, what do we do about those kinds of attributes where we want to give people some idea that think twice before you worry your head about whether you need this attribute or not, or whether it's going to be available to you, or whether anybody you talk to wants to know it. So the question for the board, I think, is just how do we go about that? The messaging, the evaluation of labeling something as deprecated or no longer recommended. eduPerson targeted ID is one of those that suggests itself as a candidate for thinking about this, because again, lots of churn in the person identifier space that probably indicates worth a look. So in any case, it's like, really, how do we go about this? Make it clear to people what we're saying and recommending. And again, there's this additional requirement under deprecation that whatever we do about that, we're not going to sort of unassign voids that are already assigned to particular attributes and then reassign them to others. So, things like that, again, that are meant to not create ripples in the deployment and implementation and use of these things. But again, work in progress in the sense of we haven't got final answers or even proposed answers that we're ready to put out for a consultation, but it's coming. Those things will come. Next slide, please. So this slide is headed related work, meaning related to REFEDS and schema and standardizations, but going on under other organizational auspices. And the big one that I'm aware of, partly because I'm up to my neck involved in it, is this I2 Trusted Access Platform, or TAP. It's also called In Common Trusted Access Platform, Software Integration Working Group. The name kind of gives it away. We have in TAP the notion of an IAM suite, not only open source reference implementations of major components like registries and directories and access management tools like Cooper, but how we integrate out to either systems providing data or systems needing to be provisioned. So a rich field of topics. And part of that work ends up being in the space of APIs and schemas. So just a few notes about that. Ben is here, and that timing is perfect because I think he's the best person to say a bit about these next three items.
Sure. So the attribute dictionary is sort of an exercise in abstraction of interest largely to the schema authors, more than the general public. But the idea behind that, and by the way, the link all the way at the bottom of the slide to the GitHub repo will get you to the first 3 bullet items with some amount of navigation below that tree. The attribute dictionary is intended to be sort of a mechanism for normalizing attribute definitions. So, the fact that something is called CN in an LDAP schema, but in a JSON schema might be called name with multiple value components, or maybe not, maybe it's display name or something like that, is intended to be addressed by the attribute dictionary, which says, okay, well, if you're defining name, here's the abstract definitions of names, and then you can map it into your actual implementation. Ultimately, this allows us to crosswalk, although obviously we're not really doing much with that yet at the moment. There's some thought that that might eventually move from the TAP working group into the schema board. We haven't really explored that seriously yet. We just sort of floated that as an idea. Then there are a couple of APIs under development in the software integration working group, which are maybe schema adjacent. An ID match API, which is designed to transfer the question of, are these 2 entities the same entity? It doesn't answer the question, it just provides the transport mechanism between a client and a server. And then a newer one that we're still kind of hashing out called the namespace API, which is designed for kind of more of the larger R1-ish kind of entity that has a lot of legacy namespace or identifier assignment happening all over the place, and is attempting to provide some mechanism at if not centralizing it, at least coordinating it. So, historically, a very common use case would be you get an account on the CS system, for example, and you get a net ID within the CS department that has nothing to do with your central net ID that drives your email address at the campus or something like that. So the namespace API is again, it's a transport thing. It doesn't actually implement anything, but is intended to help coordinate those requests. So perhaps requesting an identifier from CS makes it unavailable at the campus level, even though it wasn't requested from campus. And there are a few other use cases that come out of that as well. So the ID match API has been around actually in various iterations for quite a while and is pretty stable at this point. The namespace API is a .1 kind of thing where we're still looking for interested parties to comment and contribute, which can be done either via the software integration working group itself or via the discussion lists or via the GitHub issue tracker associated with the various projects. I think that's probably good enough for this level of detail, though. As always, I'm happy to answer questions later when we get to the Q&A.
All right. I'll pick up on the next bullet, but one note on the ID match API, I think, well, I know it has the distinction of having 2 independent implementations of the API now, one in co-manage, no surprise, but another one in the Evolvium Corporation's open source midpoint product, which is can serve as both an identity registry, but really shines as a provisioning engine. And that now includes in its latest general release an ID match capability based on the same API as co-manage. So that feels like a victory of sorts.
Yeah, so I believe that makes it officially a standard, right?
Yeah, right. 2 yes, okay. I wanted to say a bit about some other work that we're hoping to draw from that would make some of the things we're doing even more general. That is, some of these things are at a global level of proposal. So I'll just talk about those briefly. There's the Open API initiative, and there's a JSON schema work going on. I would love it if JSON schema could get beyond expired IETF draft documents, and I see a lot of activity on their lists, so I haven't given up on that happening. But as it stands in its current draft, which is December of 2021, and there are IETF drafts for JSON schema. It's the major parts have been stable for several steps now. So I guess we have to debate among ourselves whether we want to hitch ourselves and make use of that, even though it's not officially yet a standard. The Open API initiative, such as it is a published standard. It's not an IETF one yet, but at any rate, so the point with this is that the combination of them provide a way to both essentially write your API specification, but end up having it able to document itself and lends itself to code generation tools, so you can generate stubs for clients and servers for given APIs in a variety of programming languages. So that seems a useful thing to follow. So I guess with the latest Open API Initiative 3.1, they have finally achieved full compatibility with the JSON schema of it. So in other words, if you're developing an API and you want to define the request and response bodies, the Open API Initiative proposals in that space are JSON schema compatible, which is good, right? We don't want those two things competing with each other. That's great. So just to point out a couple ways that people can get familiar with this is the Swagger Hub, which is a commercial product, but also has, like many commercial products, a freemium offering. And that freemium offering includes what I would call a playground. And then there are serious tools in addition to or included in what looks like a playground, where you can plug some samples in and then see what the documentation would look like, or see what a Java client might look like, at least in the stub. So if you're just interested in getting a little feel for Open API Initiative and JSON schema, that's a good place to start. But there's a pretty impressive collection of implementations of JSON schema tools. And most of these in that linked list are open source licenses, which is good news. So you're not limited to using Swagger Hub, because they're the ones that really pushed the development of this. We do have all these other tools available for everything from validation to code generation to documentation, etc. Well, yeah. Ben already mentioned the fact that under this snippet and working doc site, GitHub Internet 2u/API-schema, there are a lot of working products and sort of preliminary formulations of things. And so very often you will find, if we're talking about something, that we'll give you a link under that space, and then they'll migrate eventually to the more formally adapted and final version of things. So that's what's going on in I2Tap software. I think I would like one thought that's I would like to propose that the Schema Board take up and discuss is the notion that if we have the attribute dictionary that Benno was talking about, one derivative of that could be a JSON schema-based representation of that attribute dictionary. And the reason I say that, rather than mapping directly from the attribute dictionary to, say, SAML or LDAP, is that included in that list of tools are several things for mapping JSON schema to, say, XML schema docs, XSD, and other forms. So the nirvana for this kind of thing is to have a specification language that can be And if you come up with a new protocol, a new transport, and you want to generate the spec for that, wouldn't it be nice if you could define a mapping from a JSON schema representation, which is shared by multiple protocols and applications, to the transport that you're trying to define and create. So it's, I think, worth a little discussion. As I say, it probably would be a no-brainer if JSON schema or a formal spec, but I think we're headed in that direction. It's probably a good time to at least ask whether something like that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't for various reasons, but just a thought. Next slide, please. So here's some more connection information about the In Common Trusted Access Platform Software Integration Working Group. We meet Wednesdays, every other Wednesday, and then on the off weeks, we meet Friday, every other Friday, 3 Eastern and 10 a.m. Eastern. We are very open to agenda suggestions. You know, with a title like software integration, a lot of things are theoretically in scope, and usually we would just take an item like that, find a good time to put it on an agenda, and make sure we had the right people on that call to make it you know, useful and valuable discussion. The final bullet here is to subscribe to the In Common TAP Software Integration Working Group mailing list, somewhat non-obviously named INC Trust SI, but the SI is software integration. In Common Trust is the sort of branding of the In Common Trust and Identity Initiative as a whole. So there's that. The next slide, I believe, is more general slides back to the SCHAC and Schema Editorial Board kinds of things. So the first link there is, that ends in Stan, is for Schema. Sorry, yeah, what is that? Schema and something. But anyway, you can see it if you click on it. I guess I could do that, but I won't right now. It's basically the top level for it. For example, you'll find under that the work of the Schema Editorial Board. That's a left narrative column item there under that Stan.
It's short for standards.
Standards. That's too obvious. I was trying to do acronym schema. Yeah. Anyway,
yeah,
okay.
we'll backronym it to something.
Sure, it's still possible. The schema discuss is a list that's already been mentioned for weighing in on any of the topics that the Schema Editorial Board is chewing on. And then we have direct links to the specs for eduPerson and voPerson. Join a subcommittee, join the board. Those things are options starting at the Stan page again. And that's it for the slides. If Heather or Ben want to expand a bit on the joining part, subcommittee or board, that I would welcome them to take that. But that's what I have.
It's certainly easy enough. If you go to the wiki, you'll see what subcommittees currently exist. If you have an idea of a new attribute or a way to handle the schema, or if you want to say, hey, I agree with Keith and I want a JSON profile, then drop me a note. I think everybody knows how to reach out to me, and we can just make that happen. Similarly with the board, if you do want to participate at that level, drop me a note, and I'm happy to have that conversation. And I think that brings us to Q&A. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Well, as a delaying tactic for folks to think about any questions they might have, I will observe Keith, I think on the JSON schema note, I feel like we did some work on that at some point a couple of years ago.
Yep.
We should probably go dig through the archives. There may be some drafts that are, maybe just slightly out of date or something.
No, right. I think you managed to make sure there were JSON schema reps for some of our core work. So yes, I agree. It's partly picking it up, dusting off, and asking again whether there's more than meets the eye there. Yeah, I was pretty sure there'd be a lot of questions because of all these exclamation marks in our slide headers, but it's an extravaganza after all. So.
It is. It is. With regards to the JSON schema work, I know you intimated that you were watching the mailing list at the IETF. Are you participating?
I haven't. Well, COVID would explain the last couple of years of not attending ITF meetings, but that's not an excuse. I would, if we get to the point where we actually want to make use of this, I would say we need to depute somebody to participate in that work directly. I stay in touch with their mailing list, and it's down in nitty gritty at this point. It would be great if they would also have this conversation at a higher level about moving it forward and getting at least a currently valid IETF draft. So,
well,
yeah.
if nothing else, I'm sure they would love to. I mean, post to the list and say, "Hey, we here over in the higher ed community are watching this. We are considering work in this direction. Here's what we have." And just, one of the things that often will help something like that progress is just an awareness of the core working group members that there are people out there watching, that there are other parties interested, and that the work is being consumed. Otherwise, it's like shouting into a vacuum, and they don't.
Yeah.
They'll put as much energy into it as they are given to inspire them.
And they'll be talking to each other so much that it will become a sort of private vocabulary and pet topics and things. We've seen that ourselves.
we have. So even if we don't deputize someone to be an active, engaged, hold the pen participant in that working group, dropping them a note just to say thank you and we're watching and we're considering using this would be an enormous help, I think.
I think that's right. I guess I wanted to just underscore one thing about the Open API work. That is, eventually these schema do need to get implemented in some code somewhere. And I think for those people that have that on their list, really would save themselves some trouble, I think, and help the rest of us follow along if they looked at least at the Open API specifications and some of the examples, and maybe even use the code generators, certainly the documentation generators, to speed up their API specification process, because schema on their own, they just kind of sit there. So got to put them to work.
I will say that, I guess what enlightened self-interest is that the phrase, from with my co-managed project head on, we are absolutely using the schemas that we're participating in, or really we're using the APIs that then reference the schemas. So, the ID match API in turn is built on top of the attribute dictionary, the namespace API, I guess theoretically the same. And then on top of that, we also have some other APIs that are not exactly based on the standards, but are based on some of the very early draft work before it was called tier. But is again basically built on top of the attribute dictionary as well. So so we're definitely all in on this model. And then to the extent that we can, convince the rest of the community to go all in also, we're happy to talk on Zoom calls.
Fair enough. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you everybody who joined. If you are interested in participating, you now know how. And if you're watching the recording later, you also now know how to participate, and we welcome you with open arms, as it were. I do hope that I will see many of you at the upcoming REFEDS meeting adjacent to TNC 22. Even if you won't be there in person, there will be some remote participation. And yeah, it should be a good time to be had by all. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your attention. And I will talk to you all later. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
So
everyone.
long.